The 1950s have the popular image of the happy days when the nation prospered and teens enjoyed the new beat of rock and roll music. This nostalgic view of the 50s is correct, but limited. The decade started with a war in Korea and the accusations of McCarthyism. From the point of view of African Americans, what mattered most about the 1950s was not so much the music of Elvis Presley, but the resistance of Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. to segregation in the South, while middle-class suburbanites enjoyed their chrome-trimmed cars and turned into I Love Lucy on their new television sets. The Cold War and threat of nuclear destruction loomed in the background. The 1960s were in many ways both the best and worst of times. On the one hand, the post-war economic prosperity peaked in the 1960s. At the same time, racial strife, a controversial war in Vietnam, and student radicalism started to tear the country apart. The proud superpower began to learn its limits both in the jungles of Vietnam and on the streets at home. So we're going to look at first the foreign policy of Eisenhower and Kennedy, and later we'll look at what is happening at home. Much as Franklin Roosevelt dominated the 1930s, President Dwight Ike Eisenhower personified the 1950s. The Republican campaign slogan, "I like Ike," expressed the genuine feelings of millions of middle-class Americans. They liked his winning smile and trusted and admired the former general who had successfully commanded Allied forces in Europe in World War II. Most of Eisenhower's attention in both the first and second terms focused on foreign policy and various international crises arising from the Cold War. The experienced diplomat who helped to shape U.S. foreign policy throughout Eisenhower's presidency was Secretary of State John Foster Dulles. Dulles had been critical of Truman's containment policy as too passive. He advocated a new look to U.S. foreign policy and took the initiative in challenging the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China. He talked of liberating captive nations of Eastern Europe and encouraging the nationalist government of Taiwan to assert itself against Red China. Dulles pleased conservatives and alarmed many others by declaring that if the United States pushed communist powers to the brink of war, they would back down because the American nuclear superiority. His hard line became known as brinkmanship. In the end, however, Eisenhower prevented Dulles from carrying his ideas to an extreme. Decolonization, or the collapse of colonial empires after World War II, may have been the single most important development of the post-war era. Between 1947 and 1962, dozens of colonies in Asia and Africa gained their independence from former colonial powers such as Britain, France, and the Netherlands. In Asia, India and Pakistan became new nations in 1947, and the Dutch East Indies became the independent country of Indonesia in 1949. In Africa, Ghana threw off British colonial rule in 1957, and a host of other nations followed. These new third world countries, in contrast to the industrialized nations of the Western Bloc and the Communist Bloc, often lacked stable political and economic institutions. Their need for foreign aid from either the United States or the Soviet Union often made them into pawns of the Cold War. Part of the new look in Eisenhower's conduct of U.S. foreign policy was the growing use of covert action. Undercover intervention in the internal politics of other nations seemed less objectionable when employing U.S. troops and also proved less expensive. In 1953, the CIA helped overthrow a government in Iran that had tried to nationalize the holding of foreign oil companies. The overthrow of the elected government allowed for the return of the Shah of Iran. The Shah, in return, provided the West with favorable oil prices and made enormous purchases of American arms. In Guatemala in 1954, the CIA overthrew a leftist government that threatened American business interests. U.S. opposition to communism seemed to drive Washington to support corrupt and often ruthless dictators, especially in Latin America. In addition, the CIA acted in secret under lax control by civilian officials, planned assassinations of national leaders such as Fidel Castro of Cuba. CIA operations fueled anti-American feelings, especially in Latin America, but the long-term damage was a U.S. relations with Iran. During Eisenhower's first year in office, some of the most serious Cold War challenges concerned events in East Asia and Southeast Asia. After losing their Southeast Asian colony of Indochina to Japanese invaders in World War II, the French made the mistake of trying to retake it. Wanting independence, native Vietnamese and Cambodians resisted. French imperialism had the effect of increasing support for nationalist and communist leader Ho Chi Minh. By 1950, the anti-colonial war in Indochina became part of the Cold War rivalry between communist and anti-communist powers. Truman's government started to give U.S. military aid to the French, while China and the Soviet Union aided the Viet Minh guerrillas led by Ho Chi Minh. In 1954, a large French army at Dien Bien Phu was trapped and forced to surrender. After this disastrous defeat, the French tried to convince Eisenhower to send in U.S. troops, but he refused. At the Geneva Conference of 1954, France agreed to give up Indochina, which was divided into the independent nations of Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. By the terms of the Geneva Conference, Vietnam was to be temporarily divided at the 17th parallel until a general election could be held. The new nation remained divided, however, as two hostile governments took power on either side of the line. In North Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh established a communist dictatorship. In South Vietnam, a government emerged under Diem, whose support came largely from anti-communist, Catholic, and urban Vietnamese, many of whom had fled from communist rule in the north. The general election to unite Vietnam was never held, largely because South Vietnam's government feared that the communists would win. From 1955 to 1961, the United States gave over $1 billion in economic and military aid to South Vietnam in an effort to build a stable anti-communist state. In justifying this aid, President Eisenhower made an analogy to a row of dominoes. According to this domino theory, if South Vietnam fell under communist control, one nation after another in Southeast Asia would also fall until Australia and New Zealand were in dire danger. To prevent South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia from falling to communism, Dulles put together a regional defense pact called the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, or SEATO. Agreeing to defend one another in case of an attack within the region, 8 nations signed the pact in 1954: the United States, Great Britain, France, Australia, New Zealand, the Philippines, Thailand, and Pakistan. In the Middle East, the United States tried to balance maintaining friendly ties with the oil-rich Arab states while at the same time supporting the new state of Israel. The latter nation was created in 1948 under UN auspices after the civil war of the British Mandate territory of Palestine left the land divided between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Israel's neighbors, including Egypt, had fought unsuccessfully to prevent the Jewish state from being formed. Led by the Arab nationalist General Gamal Nasser, Egypt asked the United States for funds to build the ambitious Aswan Dam project on the Nile River. The United States refused, in part because Egypt threatened Israel's security. Nasser turned to the Soviet Union to help build the dam. The Soviets agreed to provide limited financing for the project. Seeking another source of funds, Nasser precipitated an international crisis in July of 1956 by seizing and nationalizing the British and French-owned Suez Canal that passed through Egyptian territory. Loss of the canal threatened Western Europe's supply line to Middle Eastern oil. In response to this threat, Britain, France, and Israel carried out a surprise attack against Egypt and retook the canal. Eisenhower, furious that he had been kept in the dark about the attack by the old allies, the British and French, sponsored a UN resolution condemning the invasion of Egypt. Under pressure from the United States, the world public opinion, the invading forces withdrew. The United States quickly replaced Britain and France as the leading Western influence in the Middle East, but it faced a growing Soviet influence in Egypt and Syria. In a policy pronouncement later known as the Eisenhower Doctrine, the United States in 1957 pledged economic and military aid to any Middle Eastern country threatened by communism. Eisenhower first applied his doctrine in 1958 by sending 14,000 Marines to Lebanon to prevent a civil war between Christians and Muslims. In Eisenhower's last year in office, 1960, the Arab nations of Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, and Iran joined Venezuela to form the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC. Oil was shaping up to be a critical foreign policy issue. The combination of Western dependence on Middle East oil, Arab nationalism, and a conflict between Israeli and Palestinian refugees would trouble American presidents in the coming decades. For U.S. security, nothing was more crucial than U.S. diplomatic relations with its chief political and military rival, the Soviet Union. Throughout Eisenhower's presidency, the relations between the two superpowers fluctuated between periods of relative calm and extreme tension. After Stalin's death in 1953, Eisenhower called for a slowdown in the arms race and presented to the United Nations an Atoms for Peace plan. The Soviets also showed signs of wanting to reduce Cold War tensions. They withdrew their troops from Austria and established peace relations with Greece and Turkey. By 1955, a desire for improved relations on both sides resulted in a summit meeting in Geneva, Switzerland, between Eisenhower and the new Soviet premier, Nikolai Bulganin. At this conference, the U.S. president proposed an open skies policy over each other's territory, open to aerial photography by the opposing nation, in order to eliminate the chance of a surprise nuclear attack. The Soviets rejected the proposal. Nevertheless, the spirit of Geneva, as the press called it, produced the first thaw in the Cold War. Even more encouraging from the U.S. point of view was a speech by the new Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev, in early 1956, in which he denounced the crimes of Joseph Stalin and supported peaceful coexistence with the West. The relaxation of the Cold War encouraged workers in East Germany and Poland to demand reforms from their communist governments. In October of 1956, a popular uprising in Hungary actually succeeded in overthrowing a government backed by Moscow. The new, more liberal leaders wanted to pull Hungary out of the Warsaw Pact. This was too much for the Kremlin, and Khrushchev sent in Soviet tanks to crush the freedom fighters and restore control over Hungary. The United States took no action in the crisis. Eisenhower feared that sending in troops to aid the Hungarians would touch off a major war in Europe. In effect, by allowing Soviet tanks to roll into Hungary, the United States gave the de facto recognition to the Soviet sphere of influence in Eastern Europe and ended Dulles' talk of liberating this region. Soviet suppression of the Hungarian revolt also ended the first thaw in the Cold War. In 1957, the Soviet Union shocked the United States by launching the first satellites, Sputnik 1 and Sputnik 2, into orbit around the Earth. Suddenly, the technological leadership of the United States was open to question. To add to American embarrassment, U.S. rockets designed to duplicate the Soviet achievement failed repeatedly. What was responsible for this scientific debacle? American schools became the ready target for criticism of their math and science instruction and failure to produce more scientists and engineers. In 1958, Congress responded with the National Defense and Education Act, which authorized giving hundreds of millions of federal money to the schools for math, science, and foreign language education. Congress in 1958 also created the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA, to direct the U.S. efforts to build missiles and explore outer space. Billions were appropriated to compete with the Russians in the space race. Fears of nuclear war were intensified by Sputnik, since the missiles that launched the satellites could also deliver thermonuclear warheads anywhere in the world in minutes, and there was no defense against them. We will bury capitalism, Khrushchev boasted with new confidence and pride based on Sputnik. The Soviet leader pushed the Berlin issue in 1958 by giving the West 6 months to pull its troops out of West Berlin before turning over the city to the East Germans. The United States refused to yield. To defuse the crisis, Eisenhower invited Khrushchev to visit the United States in 1959. At the presidential retreat of Camp David in Maryland, the two agreed to put off the crisis and scheduled another summit conference in Paris for 1960. The friendly spirit of Camp David never had a chance to produce results. 2 weeks before the planned meeting in Paris, the Russians shot down a high-altitude U.S. spy plane, the U-2, over the Soviet Union. The incident exposed a secret U.S. tactic for gaining information. After its open skies proposal had been rejected by the Soviets in 1955, the United States had decided to conduct regular spy flights over Soviet territory to find out about its enemy's missile program. Eisenhower took full responsibility for the flights after they were exposed by the U-2 incident. But his honesty proved to be a diplomatic mistake. Khrushchev denounced the United States and walked out of the Paris summit to temporarily end the thaw in the Cold War. Perhaps more alarming than any other Cold War development during the Eisenhower years was the loss of Cuba to communism. A bearded revolutionary, Fidel Castro, overthrew the Cuban dictator, Batista, in 1959. At first, no one knew whether Castro's politics would be better or worse than those of his ruthless predecessor. Once in power, however, Castro nationalized American-owned businesses and properties in Cuba. Eisenhower retaliated by cutting off U.S. trade with Cuba. Castro then turned to the Soviets for support. He also revealed that he was a Marxist and soon proved it by setting up a communist totalitarian state. With communism only 90 miles off the shores of Florida, Eisenhower authorized the CIA to train anti-communist Cuban exiles to retake their island. But the decision to go ahead with the scheme was left up to the next president, Kennedy. The 1960s began with an election that proved symbolic of the changes that were to come. President Eisenhower had not been able to transfer his popularity to other Republicans, and the Democrats retained control of Congress through Eisenhower's last 2 years in office. The new medium of television was perhaps the most decisive factor in the close race between the two youthful campaigners, Nixon and Kennedy. In the first of 4 televised debates, the first such debates in campaign history, Kennedy appeared on screen as more vigorous and comfortable than the pale, intense Nixon. On the issues, Kennedy attacked the Eisenhower administration for the recent recession and for permitting the Soviets to take the lead in the arms race. In reality, what Kennedy called a missile gap was actually in the U.S. favor, but his charges seemed plausible after Sputnik. As the first Catholic presidential candidate since Al Smith in 1928, Kennedy's religion became an issue in the minds of some voters. Religious loyalties helped Nixon in rural Protestant areas, but helped Kennedy in the large cities. In one of the closest elections in U.S. history, Kennedy defeated Nixon by a little more than 100,000 popular votes and by a slightly wider margin of 303 to 219 in the Electoral College. Many Republicans, including Nixon, felt the election had been stolen by Democratic political machines in states like Illinois and Texas by stuffing ballot boxes with votes of the deceased. Much of Kennedy's interest lied with foreign policy issues. In 1961, he set up the Peace Corps, an organization that recruited young American volunteers to give technical aid to developing countries. Also in 1961, he organized the Alliance for Progress, which promoted land reform and economic development in Latin America. Kennedy did persuade Congress to pass the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, which authorized tariff reductions with the recently formed European Economic Community, or the Common Market, of Western European nations. Kennedy made a major blunder shortly after entering office. He approved a Central Intelligence Agency scheme planned under the Eisenhower administration to use Cuban exiles to overthrow Fidel Castro's regime in Cuba. In April of 1961, the CIA-trained force of Cubans landed at the Bay of Pigs in Cuba, but failed to set off a general uprising as planned. Trapped on the beach, the anti-Castro Cubans had little choice but to surrender after Kennedy rejected the idea of using U.S. forces to save them. Castro used the failed invasion to get even more aid from the Soviet Union and to strengthen his grip on power. Trying to shake off the embarrassment of the Bay of Pigs defeat, Kennedy agreed to meet Soviet Premier Khrushchev in Vienna in the summer of 1961. Khrushchev seized the opportunity in Vienna to threaten the president by renewing Soviet demands that the United States pull its troops out of Berlin. Kennedy refused. In August, the East Germans, with Soviet backing, built a wall around West Berlin. Its purpose was to stop East Germans from fleeing to West Germany. As the wall was being built, Soviet and U.S. tanks faced off in Berlin. Kennedy called up the reserves, but he made no move to stop the completion of the wall. In 1963, the president traveled to West Berlin to assure the residents of continuing U.S. support. To cheering crowds, he proclaimed, "Freedom has many difficulties and democracy is not perfect, but we have never had to put up a wall to keep our people in. As a free man, I take pride in the words, 'I am a Berliner,'" which he spoke in German. The Berlin Wall stood as a gloomy symbol of the Cold War until it was torn down by rebellious East Germans in 1989. Lastly, let's look at Kennedy's final test during the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis. The most dangerous challenge from the Soviets came in October of 1962. U.S. reconnaissance planes discovered that the Russians were building underground sites in Cuba for the launching of offensive missiles that could reach the United States in minutes. Kennedy responded by announcing to the world that he was setting up a naval blockade of Cuba until the weapons were removed. A full-scale nuclear war between the superpowers seemed likely if Soviet ships challenged the U.S. naval blockade. After days of tension, Khrushchev finally agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for Kennedy's pledge not to invade the island nation and to later remove some U.S. missiles from Turkey. The Cuban Missile Crisis had a sobering effect on both sides. Soon afterward, a telecommunications hotline was established between Washington and Moscow to make it possible for the leaders of the two countries to talk directly during a crisis. In 1963, the Soviet Union and the United States, along with nearly 100 other nations, signed the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty to end the testing of nuclear weapons in the atmosphere. This first step in controlling the testing of nuclear arms was offset by a new round in the arms race for developing missiles and warhead superiority.